Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome on this blessedly cold and dreary June day. I'm Anushka Kenley. I'm head of social sector at PBE, and I'm going to be leading you through today's session, which is reflecting on the state of trustee diversity and exploring how charities can develop more diverse and inclusive boards. So this discussion today builds on the report that PBE published earlier this year. It was authored by two of my former PBE colleagues, Daisy Harmer and Antonia Wren, and it was completed in partnership with the Charity Commission of England and Wales. Before I get started, I just want to share that today's event is being recorded and it's going to be available on the PBE website and on the YouTube channel after this session. So anybody who's missed today's session but wants to watch back, please feel free to share. We will have some time for audience questions at the end of the session, so please feel free to submit them in the chat and we will get to as many of them as we can. And finally, we'd love for you to post about the event on social media, tag us on LinkedIn or Blue Sky, or use the hashtag PBE events anywhere else. Now, we're very lucky today. We have a really fantastic lineup of speakers coming to join us. So let me quickly run through who they are. We are joined, first of all, by Gino Parker, who is Director of the Building Independence Programme at Henry Smith Foundation. Renamed today, I understand, so hot off the press. Gino has really wide experience across the sector, not just at Henry Smith Foundation, so we're really grateful to have her on our panel. We will also, there we go. We're also joined by Holly Riley. Holly is Head of Strategic Policy at the Charity Commission for England and Wales. Holly was also really instrumental in getting this research off the ground and helping us design it. So brilliant to have Holly with us. We're joined by Malcolm John, who is the founder of Board Racial Diversity UK and is a really tireless campaigner on this issue. So great to have you, Malcolm. And finally, we've got Penny Wilson, who is an inclusive governance consultant and former chief executive of Getting On Board. And again, Penny was totally brilliant when we're designing this research and a real font of knowledge and wisdom on this topic. So thank you everybody for joining us. I'm going to kick off with an overview of the key findings of the work that PBE did. So I'll run through that for about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to pass over to the other panelists for some quick reflections before we move on to our Q&A. So today I want to talk about the demographics of trustees in England and Wales. I say England and Wales because we did this work specifically with the Charity Commission of England and Wales based on their Register of Trustees. And we ran a survey with them last year. We reached more than 2,000 trustees, which was the largest survey of its kind since 2017. So we now have that data updated about trustees in 2024. You can read all the results in far more detail than I'm going to cover today in our report, and there will be a link in the chat if you want to click through and look at that report. And just to say, the report covers a lot of content. It covers a lot more detail about trustee skills, what they get out of being a trustee, the benefits of being a trustee, their experiences. Today, I'm just focused on demographics, but please do look at the report for more insights. And also to say, I will refer to a few results today that weren't included in that report. We will be publishing, PBE will be publishing all the data tables that relate to the survey later in the summer. So if you're interested in delving into that data a bit more, just keep an eye on the PBE website. We will be publishing those results. So who are trustees? Anybody new to a PBE event? There are going to be a lot of charts today. Don't worry if you're not a charts person, I'm going to walk you through all of them very carefully and slowly. This chart shows us trustees by sex. So if you look at that dark purple bar on the left-hand side, this shows you the percentage of trustees that are female, and the light pink bar shows you the percentage of trustees that are male. I'll also add that some respondents, about 2% of respondents, prefer not to say in response to this question. So this split here is just those who either chose male or female. And we can see in that first bar on the left-hand side that 43% of trustees overall are female and 57% are male. So obviously, this does not reflect the gender split in the wider population. If we move to the next column along, we can see that women are less likely to be chairs. So only about a third, 35% of chairs are women, and that's similar for the role of treasurer. Women are much more likely to be secretary. So about 58% of board secretaries are female, and we're close to gender parity on the role of vice chair. Now, when we compare these results to the last time the Charity Commission ran a survey of this kind at 2017, we can see some significant improvements. So overall, 36% of trustees were female in 2017. So there's been a 7 percentage point increase in the overall number of trustees who are female compared to 2017. There's also been quite significant increases in the proportion of chairs that are female. So it was 29% previously, now we're up to 35%, and similarly for treasurers. So we are still quite far from having an even split in terms of gender overall, but compared to 2017, we are moving in a positive direction. And I'll also add that we did find the very smallest charities, so those with an annual income under £10,000, had close to gender parity on their boards, whereas the very largest charities in our survey, those with over £5 million annual income, they had the most male-dominated boards. And just for comparison with the private sector, overall, the charity sector is looking quite similar to the private sector in terms of gender balance. So, for example, about 45% of FTSE 100 board positions are held by women. Now, just to make sure everyone's concentrating, I've flipped this chart around. This chart shows us the age profile of trustees. So just to walk you through what you're looking at, the darkest purple bars on the left-hand side show us the percentage of trustees who are under 50. The pink bars then show us the percentage who are aged between 50 and 64. The blue bars show us the percentage of trustees aged 65 to 74. And the yellow bars show us the percentage of trustees aged 75 or older. So if you train your eyes on the point at which the pink and the blue bars meet, that shows you the split between working age and retirement age, i.e. over 65 to the right and under 65 to the left. So if we look at the very bottom bar, that shows us the results for all charities overall. And the dark purple bar there shows us that 13% of trustees are aged under 50, and then around a third are aged 50 to 64, another third aged 65 to 75, and then 22% are aged over 75. So overall, 55% of trustees are aged 65 or over. And then looking above this, I've split it out by charity size. So actually, if I just move to the next slide, you can see that in a little bit more detail. So what we can see here is that generally smaller charities, that's these bars at the bottom, are more likely to have older boards. So that pink-blue split moves to the left as we move from the largest charities at the top to the smallest charities at the bottom, indicating that there are more retirement age trustees in smaller charities. So these medium-sized charities around 500,000 onwards, there's about 40 to 45% of trustees are aged over 65. And in the smallest charities, it's more like 2/3 of trustees who are over retirement age. I don't know why. It could just be that smaller charities are more reliant on trustees who can fulfill both governance and operational roles, and therefore they need more time. It could be that smaller charities are more likely to depend on their networks to recruit trustees, but there isn't such a big difference between charity size here. So I'm quite interested in your ideas, and maybe that's something we can get into in the discussion afterwards. What I can say here is that the age profile of trustees has not changed a lot since 2017. So the average age of trustees remains around 65 as it was back in 2017. There's a similar proportion of trustees who are retired as there were in 2017. More than half of trustees are retired compared to 22% of the population. Obviously, there's very good reasons why people who are retired and have more time available and may be very keen to apply their professional skills in new contexts are trustees. But this does mean that there could be some real missed opportunities for building up boards. So if we look at the other end of the age spectrum, and I haven't put it on this chart because it's so tiny, but only 1% of trustees are under 30 years old. and that is the same across charities of all sizes. And when we think about working status, around a quarter of the population of the UK is either not employed, out of work, or a full-time student, and that's only 3% when it comes to trustees. So again, something to come back to in our discussion. Now, moving on to ethnic background. The purple bars here show us the ethnic background of trustees responding to our survey, and the pink bars show us the proportion of the population from those ethnic backgrounds. So, for example, we can see here that just over 91% of trustees are from white ethnic backgrounds, while overall just over 81% of the population is from a white ethnic background. And this is very, very similar to the findings of the 2017 survey. So it certainly looks like there's further to go to ensure that trustees from a range of ethnic backgrounds reflect the wider population. However, in this chart, we take into account the age profile of trustees. So in other words, we consider the fact that trustees are overall much older than average in the population. And when we weight our survey results accordingly, so we compare ethnic backgrounds within age categories of trustees rather than just looking at the overall profile of trustees, we do see a picture that's more encouraging. So when we take into account the fact that trustees tend to be older and there is less ethnic diversity among older groups in the population, the challenge is not so much diversity by ethnic background, but diversity by age. So if we had more younger trustees and the ethnic profile of those trustees looked similar to the existing group of younger trustees, then ethnic diversity of trustees would more closely mirror the ethnic diversity of the population. So, for example, we find that the ethnic background of trustees aged over 60 is actually quite similar to the general older population for most groups. This doesn't explain everything at all. So for younger trustees, those under 60, there is still a difference in ethnic minority representation compared to the population. And much of that difference is due to the fact there are fewer trustees from Asian backgrounds compared to the population. But also when we look into this group, for example, we find there are proportionally more Black trustees than in the general population under 60. So 7% of trustees under 60 are Black compared to 5% of the population. So I think it's interesting that on both age and ethnicity, the results of our survey look very similar to 2017. And I think that's because there is a close connection between those two factors. Now, this chart tells us something about the socioeconomic background of trustees. The bar on the left shows us trustees' socioeconomic background, while the bar on the right gives us the equivalent percentages for the working age population in the UK. And we can see that in blue, that light blue colour, 57% of trustees come from professional backgrounds compared to 37% of the working population. And then down in that dark purple bar, 29% of trustees come from working class backgrounds compared to 39% of the population. Continuing this theme of socioeconomic background, average trustee household income in our survey was in the £50,000 to £59,000 category, which is much higher than the UK national average. It's also worth remembering that most trustees are retired, and we'd expect that to drive down average trustee household income because pensioner household income is lower than working age as sort of overall for the population. On the other hand, obviously, we have very few trustees under 30, very few who are out of work or who are students. So that could go some of the way to explain higher household income among trustees. So yes, again, this result about household income builds on the findings of the previous slide, that it's more likely people who are higher earners from professional backgrounds will be trustees. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind there is an age point here too. And we found this does play out a bit when we look at the affordability of being a trustee. So obviously being a trustee comes with costs, whether that's direct costs like travel or opportunity costs like time. And there is a very live debate ongoing about whether trustees should be paid or not. So this chart shows us the percentage of trustees who agree or disagree that being a trustee creates financial pressure for them, The dark purple bars shows us the percentage of trustees who agree that being a trustee creates financial pressure for them, and the pink bar is those who disagree. And anybody adding up to 100, those who didn't, who chose non-applicable aren't reported in this chart. But what this does highlight is financial pressure is much more of an issue for younger people. So particularly for trustees under 30, that bar on the far left, but actually it's still an issue for nearly 1 in 10 trustees right up to the age of about 55 when it starts to take off. In terms of disability, 17% of trustees in our survey identify as having a disability, a neurodivergence, a learning disability, a learning difficulty, or a long-term health condition. And that is much lower than the equivalent group in the general population. We don't have any data on from 2017, so we can't compare progress here. I do think this is interesting given that the social sector overall in its workforce has a much higher prevalence of people with disabilities compared to the wider economy. So separate analysis that PB has done found nearly a quarter of civil society sector employees has a disability, which is much higher than throughout the rest of the economy where the equivalent figure is 17%. Yes, it does appear that people with disabilities are less represented in sector leadership, and this chimes with other work, for example, work by Kibo a few years ago, which found relative underrepresentation among sector leaders in CEO roles of people with disabilities. Finally, in terms of sexual orientation, this is again data we didn't have in 2017, so it's great that we've now got this. Looking at the bottom 2 bars here, this shows us that a similar proportion of trustees identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or a sexual orientation other than heterosexual, as in the general population. So it's about 4% in each case. It's worth noting that about 6% of survey respondents chose prefer not to say in response to this question. Very similar to responses to the UK census. So given that that's quite a high non-response rate, we need to be a bit careful about how we treat this data, but broadly, I think this is very encouraging. So finally, what does this mean for people who are looking to build up their boards? And I think that what this data really shows is that there are some real opportunities out there. So first of all, the majority of boards, and there are various surveys that try to get at this figure, but I think it's very clear that the majority of boards are holding at least one and sometimes several vacancies. And that means there is a need for a lot of additional trustees. And it also means that existing trustees are having to work even harder to cover unfilled posts. So in our survey, more than half of trustees said they don't have enough time to fulfill their duties. And quite worryingly, about 1 in 10, approaching 1 in 10, said they felt like they would like to step down from their role, but they felt they couldn't. And that was particularly among the youngest trustees. So definitely existing trustees are feeling the pressure. As well as unfilled posts, it's also at thinking about gaps in terms of skills and experience. So obviously trustees bring a real wealth of skills and experience, and there are some areas where lots of boards feel they've really got the core issues covered. So particularly things like services, finance, governance. There are other, sometimes very key areas where boards often said they felt they would benefit from widening their skills and the experience of their trustees. So to take a really key example, fundraising, only about half of charities told us they have at least some experience or skill around fundraising on their board, and 1 in 10 said they had no experience at all of fundraising on their board. Previously reached could help both fill posts and address some skills gaps. And just to give you a couple of examples, AI feels very live and relevant. Obviously, that's going to be a growing part of all of our lives. And when we asked trustees, this was last year and things are moving on, but last year only 8% of trustees responding to our survey said they had some experience of AI, but that rose to 22% among trustees who are under 40. Similarly, in terms of cybersecurity, about 1 in 5 trustees said they had some experience of this, but that rose to about a third of trustees who are under 40. And then to take a really different issue, campaigning, about 1 in 5 trustees said they had some experience of this, but that rose to between a quarter and a third of trustees from Black and minoritized ethnic backgrounds. So, of course, every individual brings their own skills and experience to the table, but reaching different groups can help bring more of the skills in that charities really need. And my very last slide, I just wanted to say something about recruitment practices. So the main takeaway here is that trustee recruitment does remain very dominated by networks. So about 2/3 of trustees are in their post as a result of being asked either by the chair or another board member, or it could be a member of charity staff or a friend or a family member. Whereas, very few charities are using adverts. Very few using recruitment firms. Obviously, that's expensive, but very few are using adverts. And even the largest charities, only around 20% of charities with an income over £1 million use adverts to recruit trustees. So there's a lot more to say here, and I am very keen to hand over to our experienced speakers now to share their insights. What I do want to just end by saying is that at PBE, we're keen to do a lot more work using our data to understand the relationship between recruitment methods and demographics, as well as understanding the skills and experience of different trustees. So I think there's a really great opportunity here to do some more work. And if that is something that resonates with you, we need funding to make this research happen. So there are lots of ways you could get involved to help us with this. You can donate via our website. We've got a really vibrant community of high value supporters. And we also work closely with businesses through volunteer-led corporate partnerships. And if any of this is really chiming with you, if you'd like to find out more, please do get in touch and I'll connect you with our development director, Charlotte. Okay, so thank you all for bearing with me through all the charts. So many charts. No more charts today, I promise. You fulfilled your chart quota. I am going to pass over to each of our speakers now to just share a few reflections in their own time, and then we'll move on to Q&A. So can I first of all pass over to Gino?
Thank you so much, Anushka. Yeah, really interesting data. I think my first initial reflections from reading it and also thinking about the actual subject of what we're talking about here is that actually we're really at a really incredible time, and having to remember that what we're really talking about here is not lack of, there is plenty of willingness, right? And if we think about the existing people even on the boards, it feels quite something to remember, I think, is that we're actually in an incredible time where there are so many people that are actually willing to give their time to be on trustee boards. And if we think of how much the charity sector has held up the spaces of society in which we've needed that extra flex and agility to be able to respond to need, it's quite an incredible place to be. So I really want to start from a positive place of thinking about how many people it takes to make this happen. And the way that I reframe the data for me and how I try to understand it is to say, well, what's the story of that data, right? The story is firstly, how wonderful that we have it, and we have an ability to be able to tell the story from that, because that means that we know where our strengths are within the sector, and also it means where we know we might do a little bit more work. And the second part for me, my reflections on what I was really thinking about when I was looking at this, is that we mustn't lose that one of the biggest strengths that came out for me in the data and the numbers that you were talking about was the recruitment process, right? In which that people came into this opportunity to have the honour of being a trustee from another person. And sometimes in all this work and all this discussion, we can forget that interconnectedness of what this actually means. And actually what that part of the data tells me is, what are we doing in general to create a sense of purpose and people and connection through our work that goes beyond the numbers? So I think, yeah, incredible that we've got the numbers, really great to see it and to honour and say how wonderful it is that there are so many people willing to be part of boards of all ages. and all different demographics and all different people from different backgrounds. How do we understand that picture to then think about what we need to do to increase diversity in the spaces where we know that we need a little bit more strength, and in some areas much more strength, but also how wonderful that we have a really beautiful story within that says that where we're doing it right is when people connect with other people. And I think that for me is my first reflections of what I saw from what from the report and the data and the work that you've been doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Gina. And I think it's worth reflecting that there are hundreds of thousands of people giving up hours and hours of their time every week to do this work. So it's really incredible thinking about that positive resource. Holly, let me pass over to you.
Thanks, Anushka. I mean, I think, as you said, the data is really exciting that we have it, and allows us as the regulator to really understand our trustee board. I think the charity sector runs on this incredible volunteers that run them, and it's kind of welcoming those that exist. But I think the point you made of they need more help, existing trustees need more help. This isn't about kind of out with the old and in with the new. This is about getting everybody more help. And I think the guidance that we published around recruiting new trustees alongside this really kind of shows that a lot of this is just kind of thinking of different ways of doing it. So it's not necessarily saying you should do this. It's thinking of different options and different ways forward that your charity does. I think the data that we found on recruiting trustees of others said that just 6% respond to an advert is really telling, and actually just thinking of different ways of doing that, and thinking about what your board really needs. Do you need to have somebody with board experience? In a lot of cases, probably not. These things can be learned. So I think it really highlights some of the differences that exist, and some of the different ways of doing things, some of the free resources that are out there that charities can really utilise. But I think others have said it just shows the kind of really valuable work that's going on, and actually just really exciting that there's loads of new people that can get involved as well.
Great, thank you, Holly. Let me pass to Malcolm. Malcolm, reflections on that initial presentation.
Thanks, Anushka. Yeah, I really welcome the report. It's been long overdue since 2017, and I know that certainly Penny and I have been angsting for it for some time, and there's a lot of stuff in it, and I'm focusing on the racial diversity aspects. As some of you may know, I've been campaigning for the last 4 or 5 years around increasing racial diversity on boards. And the figures, which have stayed at 8% in particular, given the 3% increase in population, is, for me, not brilliant news. And I think the report highlights some of the areas why that's happening, and which I'm sure we'll pick up on. One reflection for me is that after 2020, Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's murder, whether actually there was a big move towards more diversity on boards, more inclusive recruitment, whether experience on boards and inclusion has not been as it should be, and people have actually left, is perhaps something which is worth exploring, perhaps in some future research. I also think that there's no stats, as far as I can see, on women, on Black and Asian women on boards. In 2017, it was again fewer than 3% of women were from Black and Asian background, which is a pretty shocking figure. Lived experience, again, it'll be interesting to find out more about lived experience on boards, because again, that's crucial to every board's perspectives and organisational benefits. I'm also a trustee of Association of Chairs, so the role of chairs on boards is crucial. And again, quite interesting. I noticed most of the responses were from chairs and treasurers. So clearly, that will clearly affect, again, I think, a lot of the findings. So there's a lot of stuff, I think, in the report to pick up on, and I'll be very interested in finding out some of these issues in more detail as we go on. So thank you, Anushka.
Great, thank you, Malcolm. And I will just jump in to say that, you know, some of those points around sort of intersectionality and some of those specific experiences, they're all things we'd love to have the time to do some more research on. And we do have the data from that survey. So I'll repeat, if anybody's keen supporters to do that, that would be brilliant. Penny, let me pass over to you.
Thank you, Anushka. I mean, I think these results are just massively disappointing. You know, we've had a vague improvement in gender. We've got a bit of a move in household income towards the wider population, but it's still nothing to be proud of, is it? And racial diversity has worsened since 2017. So I just feel like the time for talking is over. We really need bold and urgent action. At the moment, how can we possibly do our best as a sector when our most senior leaders just don't reflect the communities we serve? So I guess an appeal to all of us, what can we do to shift this? What can we do on our own boards as staff and trustees? Can we become a trustee if we're not a trustee already? Can we speak out about this issue? How do we support organisations like Malcolm's? And then what programs can we run to widen the trustee pipeline and to train organisations in how to recruit trustees inclusively? And more importantly, what happens when they actually get there in inclusive governance? And it's brilliant to see some examples in the chat already of organisations already doing that.
Lovely, thank you, Penny. And you know, that chat looks very busy, so I think we'll move just straight onto the Q&A. And I'll open this up to anybody who's keen to jump in first. Although Penny, maybe just following on for your comments, and then go straight to a question from Lisa at Autism at Kingwood, and she asks, when recruiting new trustees, how can we get in front of a wider range of people so we can increase diversity on our boards?
Sure, happy to kick us off. I mean, I think the starting point is that most people don't know about trusteeship. And I think we really forget that when we're recruiting. So we go out saying, would you like to be a trustee? And people are like, well, what the hell's that? So I think changing how we recruit in terms of language, recruiting openly. You know, I don't think it's a good news story that most trustees are being recruited by being asked. We're just going to recruit more people like us, and there's nothing wrong with us. But as one of the other panelists said, we need more than us. We need other perspectives here. So going out openly, remembering that people don't know what trustees are, and then really finding the routes to people. Who are the people we need? What skills, knowledge, experience, backgrounds do they have, and how are we going to go to them? Through networks and organizations and routes to them. And this is all going to take a lot of time and a lot of legwork. It isn't quick. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that this is going to take effort, and it's worth the effort.
Thank you. Gina, I will come to you, Malcolm. I'm just interested in Gina's response to that, because you know, this is a balance, isn't it? As you said, that's a really special thing in the sector, is the idea of connection and people willingly stepping forward and making connections in their communities. But Penny also makes some good points.
No, absolutely. And I think this is the thing about it, right? It's because my experience is that I've been asked, but I've been asked because of my lived experience. So I think it's what the story that you've come from. So my experience isn't actually that I've been asked by people that look like me. I've actually been asked by people that haven't looked like me, who have said, we'd really love to have somebody like you and your insight on the board. And it's the same for me and my other colleagues. So it's that thing, isn't it, that's really tricky. Two truths can exist. So for Penny and what she spoke about, it's absolutely true that there are lots of sectors, and within the charity sector itself, where it's a bit of a handshake and it's a bit of a, I know a friend who could be a good person on the trustee board here. But equally, actually, my personal experience in the last 5 years is that there is a lot of willingness in the sector to sort of look and go, who's not sitting with us right now? And how do we bring those people in? I cannot tell you the floods of like LinkedIn or messages or calls that I get saying, could you introduce us to somebody that has this experience or that experience? And we've got to be careful here, because it's absolutely right that we think about lived experience. And I say that as somebody with lived experience who sits on a board somewhere. But we've got to ensure that the balance is that it's not extractive. Right. So until organisations are fully safe and structured, and they won't fully be 100% safe, I also don't believe in that either. But at least until we're in a place to have honest, curious, open conversations in a trusting way and be able to come over that, we're going to open the floodgates and want to raise the numbers. And then you're just going to see an exodus in a year or two afterwards. So it's actually about taking a human relational approach with the story that you understand of what your relationship is. And Penny's absolutely right about one thing, about the fact that I didn't even fully understand or know what a trustee is or does, and think of 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And I've learnt more on the job, and being in the funding sector now, of understanding the questions I want to ask to people. But it would be in a curious way and not a shaming way. It's in a curious of, why does your board look like that? Why is this functioning like that? Have you tried this? So I think, two truths can exist. It is absolutely true that lots of the sector for many years has been built on a backdoor handshake of, let me bring this person in because I think they'd be good for us, and they look exactly like me and they sit in the same circles as me. I've personally seen a shift where there are lots of people that don't look like me or from my backgrounds, really gently and kindly curious about what I could bring or my network could bring to sit on a board. So I think it's whichever side you look at it, right? And they're both right.
Brilliant, thank you. Malcolm.
Yeah, I think the key thing is, if you're a small charity, it's really tough to bring in people with skills and experience. If you've got no paid staff, you're relying on volunteers, so they need much, much, much more support. That's why they tend to go to people they know, who are largely older, within their circle and restricted. So what we've done, my own organisation, we actually developed a database we've now got, let's say, 500 network organisations on it, from which are Black and Asian network organisations. Because when we started, people were saying we can't find people with skills from different backgrounds. And that is clearly a nonsense, because, yeah, they exist in thousands. But people tend to operate within their own circles, and one can understand that. So if we can somehow support organizations looking wider by offering them resources and toolkits to do that, then I think the thing will change. But formal recruitment has to happen, and that's the only way you're going to get that more diverse population on board. But people need more support. And at the moment, I don't think it's there.
Thank you, Malcolm. And that feels like a perfect segue over to Holly. The Charity Commission of England and Wales has just produced new guidance on exactly this topic.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's about taking your time as a board to really think of these things. I completely agree with Gina. It's that you don't want people to come in and your board's actually not really ready to accommodate people. That sort of doesn't help anyone. And what one of the guidance pieces says is, this should be an ongoing process. Don't think of it as like recruiting trustees and then stopping. Actually having a kind of ongoing cycle of which trustees do you need in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years time? How is that cycle happening? Also, when people come onto the board, thinking about a really positive onboarding process. And I know this is challenging for small charities, and that's why the guidance doesn't talk in kind of must and should, as a lot of our guidance does, but things to think about as we go. But I think just investing in your trustees as well, once they join the board, is really important. So think of it as moving on, but also taking that time to reflect. Actually, if people do leave your board after a year, why? Have those exit interviews and really understand, is there small changes that can be made? For example, are all your meetings in person, and switching to kind of a hybrid approach would be really vital. Are your board papers accessible? Can people really understand what they're saying? So I think as what the guidance kind of tries to encourage is just deeper thinking about the role of trustee and who those people are, to make sure they do with that. Think about the board and the skills, and really take your time over this. It shouldn't just be a kind of peak every 5 years that you think about what you need to do. And hopefully that kind of spreads that thinking across and really embeds it in the way boards do, which makes it a better experience for charities and for the trustees that are incoming.
Brilliant. Thanks, Holly. And I think we're sort of moving into some of this space of practical ways that you could ensure that you're attracting different people and also helping people feel supported when they're in post, so that they can really give their most as a trustee. So maybe following on from this, another audience question, what are the panel's latest thoughts on paying trustees as a way to increase board diversity? Is anybody very keen to jump in on this topic? So it's a delicate topic. Anyone brave enough to?
I think from a regulator's perspective, we're firmly committed to the fact that trusteeship should be a voluntary thing and kind of not seeking to change that. From my perspective, I always think that paying trustees seems like a kind of quick fix. You know, if you pay them, you're going to get lots of different people. But I think actually it's not. That's not necessarily going to fix the fact that trustees aren't recruited in different ways, that it doesn't reach different people, that their experience once they join the board doesn't fit with what they need and those things. So for me, it's not only is there something kind of quite core in a regulator's perspective that paying trustees diverts the frontline services and not something that we're keen on. But I think it also isn't a quick fix, and actually it just requires a bit more deep thinking and deep action, and not kind of just taking that, I was going to say easy route out. I know it's not easy to kind of find trustees and pay them, but I think it's just, it stops us taking kind of really concerted, targeted action to fix the problems.
Anybody else want to share a view? Yeah, Penny, and then...
I mean, I agree with Holly. I agree that most trustees should be volunteers. I absolutely agree. It's not a silver bullet to board diversity. However, I think that we should be thinking about paying trustees for inclusion purposes. I'm not interested in people with loads of cash who are really senior in their day jobs. Those people are already very kindly joining our board. I'm interested in your stat, Anushka, where 21% of trustees under 30 or 30 and under said they were experiencing hardship as a result of being a trustee. That's the first time we've actually had a stat on that. And I personally have spoken to tens and tens of people over the years who have personally said that the lack of payment is a barrier to being a trustee. And then seeing that stat, that's quite stark, isn't it? So I don't see why those of us already on board should be deciding whether or not we should think about paying trustees. I think we're asking the wrong people. We're coming up with the wrong answer. And I definitely think it's an option we should be thinking more seriously about.
I think it's also really important to separate payment and expenses. So we've also just published updated guidance on expenses. And I think it's really key to explain that trustees do have a legal right to claim expenses. And sometimes we conflate the two issues of claiming expenses and payment. And we should be very clear that they're two separate things. And we've split the guidance in that newly updated version to make it very clear that the two are different things. And you can absolutely pay expenses to trustees. And
thanks, Holly. Gino?
Yeah, I actually think so. In some ways, I hear what's been said. I think that I agree with Penny on the point about the barriers. So like for me, I really wholeheartedly believe, and I say that from a point of like, I have a full-time job, so I have a salary. There is a privilege in that to be able to say that I am willing to volunteer. But I also think that it fundamentally exists that for it to be a volunteering position. What I don't think, though, we're doing well as organisations, as boards and people that sit and work alongside each other, whether that's the Charity Commission or the organisations themselves or the charity sector, is saying, well, hold on a minute, there is a need here actually, and this is a barrier, and this is stopping us from getting what we want to get. And there almost has to be a third space or a third solution that we're not exploring. And whether that's the role of funders, for example, to think about, is there a programme that we could devise that pays trustees from 18 to 30 years old? Is there a programme that people are willing, including the Charity Commission and various others, to put their money where their mouth is and say, we will develop a 5-year programme for 18 to 30-year-olds to sit on a trustee position, or young adults with disabilities that need that actual payment to be able to ensure that they are being paid because of additional expenses that the charity can't afford. I just feel like keeping the solution as like, do we pay them or do we not, just really simplifies actually quite a complex tiered issue, which is that it's a fundamental voluntary position that I think should remain, but equally we're creating a barrier for people not to be able to engage when they actually want to. And then how do we remove the barrier? And I don't think that fully sits with the Charity Commission either. I think that sits in partnership, and who's willing to put the money and the process together to say, well, how do we approach this barrier and what do we do collectively to work on it? That's what I think we've got to rethink a little bit, in my opinion.
Malcolm?
Yeah, I would support that, Gina, entirely, because most charities in themselves can't afford to pay their trustees. Some even balk at paying expenses, and they're not open about paying expenses. So there are a lot of people who will volunteer without payment because for career development purposes, whether they want to give back or lived experience. But it's also about, I think, changing the way that charities are run so that actually it fits in with people whose circumstances are not such that they can spend that time freely and willingly and often. So it's about looking at the way that we do governance so that actually it fits in with people's lifestyles much more. And I don't think we're anywhere near that sort of approach.
Thanks. And sort of building on this idea, so one of the audience questions is, do we have any idea why such a high proportion of young trustees say they would like to step down? And obviously, you know, the financial pressure is one point, but does anybody have any reflections on other factors that might be driving this, the sorts of pressures younger people on boards might feel, and any good tips for organisations that want to bring in more younger people and the sorts of practices that might support somebody in their board position?
I think I'm just going to come straight in and just say, I think we just talk a lot of jargon sometimes. And it's not that I don't think the young people are smart. They completely understand us. And it's not like we have to simplify things for simplification's sake. It's that I think we overcomplicate things sometimes in the sector. And what we really need to do is tell the story of what it means to be a trustee, and we just don't do that well. Nobody really does that well. And then I almost frame the story back in a way that people will go, oh, I identify with that story. I have a role to play in that. And I just think we're not good at doing that. And I think the over analyzing and over complicating of how we even talk about the things that we do, right, just means that some people switch off. And I think that's more true of sort of generational gaps and different ages that are emerging and different ways in which they tell the story of what it means to experience an organisation, even if it's as a person who receives the organisation or is a member of the organisation. Like, for example, a young person who attends a youth club. Not, I hate the term service user, but we know what I mean, right? So I just think that we're just not telling the story from their point of view. We're telling it from our point of view, and we've just got to get better at reframing that a little bit. I think that's just such a fundamental reason why there's a disengagement and a separation.
Yeah. Did anyone else have thoughts on engagement of younger people in
board? I mean, I actually don't think that young people don't want to become trustees. I think that they do. And it's the barriers, as Gina is implying, often against them. Language is one. Board meetings during the day for employed young trustees. So therefore, looking at employers giving more time off during the day for young trustees to do that. Boards acknowledging the fact that young people are employed during the day, their time's often limited, they may have other responsibilities, so changing the way that they do the governance. But I think it's also giving that experience to young people to take those leadership roles. And certainly we've got 2 or 3 younger trustees under 30 on my own board, and they've been absolutely brilliant. And they're co-chairing our working groups, they're contributing a lot. So the appetite is there, and I don't think it's not because they're not there. And I think it's about the system actually not changing to actually make it a more inclusive environment for younger trustees.
Penny.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think 3 things. First of all, we make the role impossible practically for people who are under 30, but people in employment, full stop. But the more, the earlier you are in your career, the less control you have over your working day. So if your working day clashes with trustees meeting, you've got a problem before you even started, haven't you? So we make the role impossible, practically speaking. I think there's really something about how young people are treated in the boardrooms, and to Gino's point about what kind of space is that, and particularly if you are the only young trustee, are people really listening to you? Are they respecting you? Do they want to hear what you've got to say? And if not, why would you want to be there? And then finally, I was just going to signpost the Young Trustees movement, because they're doing absolutely phenomenal work. And I think anybody who's looking at bringing on more young trustees, do look them up.
Yeah, and I will add that, I think there's loads of very practical guidance available. And at PBE, we are very much on a journey with our own board. And we we're not where we want to be, but we're definitely making progress. And one of the things that we've done at our board level is introduce a buddy scheme. So a new trustee will have a buddy as another board member. So that means that people who might have a little bit less experience in this space have somebody that they can ask questions to, maybe outside the intimidating space of being in that boardroom with lots of other people. But there's loads of other practical things that are available, and Young Trustees Movement, again, loads of great advice there. Holly, did you want to come in on this, or?
I was just going to, we found in the research as well that a lot of young people really see the benefit of trusteeship for their career. And I think it's kind of selling those benefits as well. We often talk about the benefit to the charity, but it's not a one-way street. Actually, there's a lot of benefit to the person as well for becoming a trustee. So I think it's really selling the impact you can have, and almost kind of testing yourself on boards if you haven't had that experience. We often hear, oh, I haven't had that experience, or I wouldn't get the trusteeship. But I think it's almost targeting those people within those professions to kind of say, actually, you can gain these skills through trusteeship, and that will kind of accelerate your career potentially as well. So it's kind of highlighting the win-win aspects of those things.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. So another audience question now, and this is around, I suppose, boards' cultural attitudes to EDI. So how do you address EDI and unconscious bias sensitivity at board level, especially as people often tend to be reactive and defensive instead of being open to really listening to perspectives diverse to their own and embracing a learning culture? How do you encourage boards to take on that learning culture? Does anybody want to share responses to that? Do you know? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm happy to, but also if anybody wants to go first. I think for me, two things. It's a very real thing. And I think that the hard thing is that people on the boards have to remember that they have a responsibility to that organisation and to the people that they're willing to serve. And what's hard for people to remember is there's a defensiveness in society at the moment, full stop. So, but then when you step into the board level, you have to be able to remove yourself from whatever else is going on for you outside. I think some of that for me comes from seeing a good chair and being able to openly challenge and talk to and even have private conversations with the chair. I think we've got to move away from feeling like that when we get stuck on a particular issue, that it creates a polarization that splits, that people are sitting right and wrong. And in all honesty, there's a lot of grit still happening today. I speak with many colleagues across the sector that sit on several different boards in different formats. The best way to think about it, or to encourage the board to do it, is to take the first step of asking whether you're doing it well enough for the very people that you're willing to serve. Because if they can't get around the reason why they need to do it for each other, they have to be able to get to behind the reason for why they're doing it for who we're serving as a board. So I would often start with, that's the first step. If you can't get the board galvanized around whether you're doing it well enough for the people that you're willing to serve first, you've got to decide whether that's the right board for you or not. And 9 times out of 10, I find that people do want to get around that, but what they can't see is what good looks like. So there's times where I've had to take personal responsibility and say, this is what good looks like. It's not perfect, it's not great, but this is what good equity practice or good anti-oppressive practice looks like when an organisation is doing well. And I think because so many of the issues are intersectional around good D&I or EDI, whichever terminology you choose to use, it can almost feel too much and too big for people. But the cost of that is that you have individuals who will suffer at the cost of that. And that's just not good enough anymore. Not with the amount of knowledge and information and training that we have available for free, let alone that organisations pay and put towards. So my advice would be is that if you cannot get the board around the how their EDI or D&I works for the very people that you're there to serve, and if you can do that, you can then work backwards and say, how does this look for the people within our organisation who work for organisation? Okay, and then how does this now look for us as a board together? If you can't make that journey in that way, there's a point where you have to decide whether the fit's right for you. And then secondly, unfortunately, because it does often fall on people with lived experience to say, okay, well, actually, I'm going to have to do that extra. And I've been there myself. I don't advocate for it. I'm just saying what I have done in the past is bring examples of what good looks like. One problem, one solution. this is a way that we can work through this together. And that often helps people kind of understand and quantify their responsibility and how they can have a part in making things better. I hope that's useful.
Thank you, Gina. And I'll just add, because there have been some questions around proportion of trustees with lived experience. We did try to get at that question in the survey. It turns out it's very, very hard to formulate a question that captures that across all sectors and topics that charities cover. So my colleague Marie is listening, and she may be able to dig out the relevant stat in time for the webinar. But we couldn't very clearly measure that, because, if you're working in culture or sport, that there's no clear way to answer that question. But I think what we did find was a large proportion of trustees certainly had a connection and experience in some way to the topic that they were working in. So that was very common across trustees that we spoke to. I think we're probably approaching the moment for the last question, and I just want to ask about. This is another audience question. How do we attract more people with disabilities? So we've talked about a whole range of demographic characteristics today. Probably some of those accessibility issues that we talked about, timings of meetings and finances, are relevant across different groups. But are there any points that people would like to raise specifically around attracting more trustees with disabilities? Penny, thank you.
I've got a story to kick us off, which is that I was at an event and we were talking about barriers to trusteeship, and a participant at the event said, "Oh, well, we can't have our meetings downstairs because our board meeting is upstairs." And they were obviously talking about physical accessibility. And I was just stopped in my tracks about how absolutely unimaginative we are about this. It's kind of shocking. So thank you for giving us the first stat we've had on the lack of disabled people on boards. We've never had that stat before. It's low. And as somebody in the chat said, given the age profile of trustees, it's particularly low. So yes, I'll start there and let another panelist come in with some solutions.
If not,
I just guess I would say that there hasn't been a similar campaign to mine or Young Trustees movements around disabilities on board, and which is shocking. And I'm not quite sure why, but I think there has to be. And hopefully this will be a first step towards starting that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think, given that this is a topic that's going to be relevant to so many of the sorry to use a phrase you hate, but the sort of the service users or the communities that charities are serving, this is going to be a group that is going to be represented among those communities. So I think it is important that we think a bit more about that accessibility, that accessibility point, and making sure that trustees are really representing the communities that charities serve in all their facets. So we're coming up to the very last 2 minutes or 1 minute. I think I'm going to call it and say that's the end of questions. I will just pass over to everybody very briefly to say if anybody has any final urgent thoughts or reflections that they haven't had the chance to share yet, speak now. Key messages? No. Okay.
I think the key message for me is just keep talking about it. Like, if you're a trustee, talk about it. Talk about it in all your networks, your friends. If you sit on a charity and you think your charity needs more trustees, talk about it, because you never know where the next trustee is. Like, it's at the next, dinner party. It can be anywhere. So just keep talking about what it means to be in experienced organisations with good trustees. That's what I'd say.
Thank you. Marco?
Yeah, my one key message is, in 5 years' time, let's not be where we are now. So action, not words, to shift the dial radically in the next 5 years. When you do your next research, Anushka, it shows a much better picture.
And I'm even grayer. I look forward to it. Holly, is your key message, make sure you look at the updated guidance?
Yes, I think look at the updated guidance. I think having the data there, data is so important in this kind of thing. But I think also just the fact that we are talking about is a regulatory thing, actually thinking about your trustees and making sure your charity runs the best it can possibly run is an issue that us as the regulator are interested in. This isn't kind of a nice to do thing. This is something that's really core to making your charity run in the best way possible. So read the guidance, understand it, think about how we can kind of have those conversations, be imaginative, do better, all the things we've kind of talked about today. I think it's a really important discussion for the whole sector to be having.
Great. Penny, would you like the final word?
Oh gosh, no pressure. I think an appeal to anybody watching that we can all do something about this, whether it's becoming a trustee, recruiting trustees, talking about it, as Gino said. So what are you going to do about this really, really serious issue in our sector?
Brilliant. Thank you, Penny. So we've hit 1 o'clock. I'm going to say thank you again to our absolutely fabulous panelists. You've all been completely brilliant. And thank you also for all the fabulous work that you do to, keep making progress in this space. Thank you again to Daisy and Antonia, who actually wrote the report. Thank you to the Charity Commission of England and Wales for commissioning the survey and making all this happen. The report's available on the PB website. It's also, I think there's a link in the chat if you want to click through and read it. If you want to hear about more future events like this, we run loads of free events at PB on loads of different topics. So sign up to the newsletter. There's a link to that in the chat. And I will wish you a goodbye and a wet and dreary and blessedly cool lunch break. Thank you, everybody.